Colonialism will be, for our concern here, the acquisition of overseas possessions, not necessarily for settlement, but to exploit the human and natural resources. Colonialization is a literary concept where a narrative turns upside down the typical relationships in a novel, and also, in this case, in practice and culture. The research question here is, how were everyday Germans engaged in imperial ideology and cultural adventurism during this time period? A period that ultimately led up to the beginnings of World War I. What's under consideration is a period that we will call the Age of New Imperialism, which began approximately in 1880 and ended with the beginning of World War I. Formally introduced in 1884-85 during the Berlin West African Conference, where the Western powers divvied up and created their territorial interests in the continent of Africa. As you can see by this map, they successfully carved up all of Africa with few exceptions. It was different from earlier periods. There was a giant eruption worldwide took place. The aggregate of ideas underpinning imperialism was philosophy, for one. Believe it or not, it was rather important. People were familiar with the works of Hegel and Schopenhauer, and as you can see, both have this kind of racist attitude, and really they believed that their particular countries were destined for greatness, and that was a driving force in imperialism at the time. Religious and humanitarian ideas were also in play during this period. There was a very paternalistic and patronizing attitude toward those people in the colonies. They need to be saved, they need to be civilized. Science was held in high regard during this period as well. Ideas like social Darwinism that evolved from Charles Darwin's ideas in biology justified the white people's and Europeans' position as the most advanced state, the most advanced beings on the planet. There were national movements as well supporting imperialism, one of which was re-identified as nationalism. Militarism was supported by leagues within these countries, particularly in Germany. There were naval and army leagues that had a great deal of influence on creating public policy. At the highest level in Germany, the Kaiser promoted a domestic policy that favored, it was called Weltpolitik, and it favored policies of naval and colonial expansion. It was also intended to diminish the power and role of socialist parties, including the SPD. So what was the state of everyday Germans? What was going on with these people at the time? Well, they had moved from the rural areas into urban. They're working in factories. The work week had become 6 days. The Socialist Party was very influential, and again, it was anti-colonialist, anti-imperial in nature. How is it that everyday Germans became engaged in imperial ideology and colonial adventurism? Well, for the first time, these people had leisure time, education was valued, there was respect for science, and there was a carnalization taking place of colonial knowledge. The hypothesis is that this created a time period in which people obtained knowledge of other Germans, of the colonized, through a variety of lenses which both shaped their perception of themselves and the world beyond Europe. I focused on 3 different venues in which I suspected Germans became engaged with the imperial ideology and the colonial project. One is ethnographic museums, Folkschauen or folk shows, children's toys, and games. With Sundays off and looking for entertainment, museums were very popular. Now, while ethnographic museums might not seem like a good time to you on a Sunday off, nevertheless they were open, they were free for the public on Sundays, and everyday Germans flocked to museums that were located in many of the major cities, and most of them had ethnographic museums. And this was a place where Germans could experience the colonial other. fascinated by exotic and grotesque sorts of things. The museum offered the opportunity to see a different world. When people went to the museums, this is what they saw. They saw heads suspended, heads encased. They began to see the people in the colonies, more as an object than as real people. What transforms about the museums during this time period is they were initially set up with the idea of showing that there was a basic unity of humanity. However, as during this imperial age, ethnographers began to see themselves as German first instead of part of an international scientific community. So what happens in the museums is, oddly, the goal of showing humanity as experienced as oneness. It really kind of highlighted, not really kind of, it really highlighted the fundamental differences between Europeans and their multiple others. In addition to the museum representations of colonial peoples, there were folklore showing that was taking place all over, extremely popular form of entertainment, with really like human zoos. Humans would be displayed from the colonies, be dressed up in traditional garb, dance, sing, perform. They saw Arabs as conducting business in bazaars. Africans were endlessly fighting. Indians from the subcontinent were displayed in beautiful costumes, decorated elephants. People from Tierra del Fuego were depicted as cannibals, for example, and after one of their performances, mock battles, war dancing, they would eat raw meat to depict themselves as, or have them depicted as cannibals. Again, a stereotypical example of what was represented were the people from the South Sea Islands, particularly Samoa. They were favorites among the Germans, it appears, because, well, they seemed to represent some sort of paradise or idyllic existence. It wasn't real for them, and certainly wasn't real for the Germans, but nevertheless, the Samoans were particularly appealing. So you might ask, how important were these folk shows in disseminating cultural knowledge, particularly this distorted perspective of cultural knowledge? Well, to give you an idea, and there were hundreds of these that took place in large cities and small. For the German East Africa exhibition, 635,000 people bought tickets. And in 1896, at the German Colonial Exhibition, in the Industrial Exhibition, over 7 million people saw the Colonial Exhibition. This display at the Toy Museum in Sonneberg, Germany, is a perfect example of my discussion of carnivalization. And this is really leads to the third thread, my research, and final one for this, was children's toys. So growing up in the age of imperialism, at least 2 generations did that. There were numerous toys, dolls, games, which embodied imperialist and colonialist themes. I was able to come to some preliminary conclusions, which will be refined later. Germans were quite aware of the colonies. They actively participated in these public representations. They were exposed to the imaginings of the colonialized other. They engaged in these visions of empire, experienced in the ideologies of imperialism, were part of the narrative that inverted relationships between the colonialized and the colonialists, and celebrating were fascinated by the fantastic and grotesque as it was represented, both in museums and certainly in the folk shows. And, however reluctant they may have been to participate in colonialism, nationalism, militarism, nevertheless, they were sufficiently engaged in the project to permit the commencement of World War I. Several people that I would like to say a brief thank you to is Dominic Gebhardt, Professor of History at the University of Bonn, Professor Roland Lotta, Professor of Political Science in Hamburg, Jerzy Skrabania, a Polish-German who is a missionary and professor and curator of the Museum for Ethnology related to Christianity in St. Augustine.